All right, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about early American foreign policy. I'm going to cover some of the issues faced by George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. The first person we'll look at is our first president, George Washington. To the left, you're going to see just a quick list of some of the important ideas to highlight, and then we'll talk about them a little more in depth. One of the biggest things that he was dealing with is that Great Britain had left troops in the Ohio River Valley after the Treaty of Paris. We're going to see how Jay's treaty relates to that, and then we'll talk about some of the advice he gave about foreign policy in his farewell address. The first issue that we have here is that British troops, after the American Revolution, were sticking around in some of the territory that was ceded to the United States, which was the land east of the Mississippi River. So as Americans were beginning to settle those different areas, they were running into some issues with British soldiers in those areas that simply were not leaving following the signing of that treaty. So the response to that was something known as Jay's Treaty. This was when George Washington sent then the Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, John Jay, to set up a treaty with Great Britain in order to get those troops to leave the Ohio River Valley. Somewhat effective, some remained, but at the same time, this was what they did in order to try to get the British troops to leave that area. The real effect of that is that it upsets France following the signing of this treaty, because they saw it as a betrayal of treaties that they had with the United States. We know that they were allied with the United States during the American Revolution and helped the United States ultimately gain their independence from Great Britain during that. So at this time, they felt as though they had been betrayed and a little bit backstabbed. Another thing that we want to talk about famously is George Washington's farewell address. He does give some advice about different topics, one of the main ones being how do we deal with foreign countries and affairs that are going on around the world. The two biggest things that we take away from his farewell address is the idea of isolationism. This is kind of remaining to ourselves, not really getting involved in world affairs. And he thought that this was the best course that the United States could take at this time. And historically, what we see is a lot of presidents being compared to the advice given by George Washington. Do they take the advice or do they do something different? The other idea that he gave was this idea of neutrality, that when we see two countries that are at war with each other, that we shouldn't choose sides when those kinds of things are going on. So we always kind of go back to this comparison and this idea of how well do we follow the advice of George Washington when dealing with foreign policy and world affairs. The next president we'll look at is John Adams. The biggest issues he had to deal with were basically the French attacking U.S. ships, and this leads us to something known as the XYZ Affair. And then, of course, the famous slogan that comes out of this, known as "Millions for defense, not a cent for tribute." So the biggest issue is the French were attacking U.S. ships. After Jay's treaty was signed, the French felt betrayed by the United States. And what we see here is that they kind of opened up the floodgates to attack any ship that was flying U.S. flags. And this becomes known as a quasi-war. The United States didn't actually declare war on France, but nonetheless, there were definitely some things going on that looked like warfare, resulting in the sinking of a lot of American ships, some loss of life, and really a lot of American cargo being lost. So lots of money that was lost in this. So we got to figure out what he's going to do about this. What he does ultimately results in what becomes known as the XYZ Affair. This is when he sent 3 envoys or representatives to France to kind of figure out what they could do about this issue of France attacking U.S. ships. But unfortunately, they run into these 3 gentlemen that become known as XYZ, and we call them French agents. They were hoping to have a meeting with a guy named Lord Talleyrand to see if they could figure this out, but X, Y, and Z said that they needed to pay a good amount of money in tribute simply to have this meeting with Lord Talleyrand. They refused to pay this and ultimately decided to head back to the United States to relay the message that was clearly given to them by the three French agents. This is when we see a lot of backlash in terms of this foreign policy, and people are saying there's no way we're going to be paying tribute to France. What we should do is invest that money into our armed forces, most notably the Navy. And that's where the chant comes from, where millions for defense, not a cent for tribute. And this is when we see the United States really putting a lot of money into the Navy. And this is really what we would see as the birth of the U.S. Navy following the XYZ Affair. Remember, one of the things we got to keep in mind is that John Adams prided himself on the fact that he did not go to war with France. So that's something to keep in mind as we take a look at this. Then we get to Thomas Jefferson. He's got a couple of issues. First is the impressment or kidnapping of American sailors being forced into the British Navy. He answers that with an embargo that ends up kind of backfiring on him. And then we've got the issue of the Barbary pirates demanding tribute of American ships that are simply doing business in the Mediterranean Sea. And then we see he takes a bit of a different approach by sending warships to protect American ships. So the first thing we'll look at is impressment. This is the practice of the British Navy capturing American sailors and forcing them into to work in the British Navy. And they saw this. They saw these sailors, and their reason for doing this was that they saw these people as deserters from the Royal Navy, and they saw anybody that was born before 1776 that happened to live in the United States of America as somebody that owed duty to or owed service to the British Navy. So they felt justified in the fact that they did this. And the numbers vary, but ultimately one of the high numbers that they say upwards of 5,000 men were forced into the British Navy. And so this is something that needs to be addressed. So Thomas Jefferson's answer to that was the Embargo Act of 1807. And an embargo is something that we see as not allowing foreign ships to come into American ports and not allowing American ships to do business in foreign ports. And what this does is the results are a lot of unhappy American sailors because they simply could not make a living under the Embargo Act, which hurt a lot of people in their ability to make money and make a living. So eventually the Embargo Act is repealed. The second issue is the issue of the Barbary pirates. In North Africa, a few areas of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, they are known as the Barbary states. And what they are is a band of what are known as corsairs that control who comes and goes in the Mediterranean Sea. And they demand tax or tribute for anybody that is passing through and sailing through the Mediterranean Sea. Americans were a bit surprised by this, but this had been something that was ongoing, and Thomas Jefferson finally decided to take some more action with this, and what he does is, our response to this is he sends military escorts with American ships. Eventually what happens, there are some incidents that surround this, and what we see end up happening is finally we see that the United States did essentially go to war with these people and destroy their camps, thus ending the tribute necessary for this. Then we come to James Madison. Some of the things he's dealing with is that the British were continuing to impress American sailors, and that Great Britain was encouraging Native Americans by supplying them with arms to make trouble for American settlers in the American frontier. And this culminates into what becomes known as the War of 1812. So what we have is we've got some issues with impressment, which we talked about earlier, so that was continuing to happen. And then we see this trouble on the frontier. There were some battles that were taking place between the Shawnee tribes being led by a person named Tecumseh. They were fighting to hang on to their ancestral homelands. And when, after some of these battles took place, particularly the Battle of Tippecanoe, what was found were British guns and ammunition were found on some of the bodies of the dead natives that were found after the battle. And so the conclusion was drawn that Great Britain was supplying the Native Americans, thus causing trouble for American settlers on the frontier. So the response to that is the War of 1812. The War of 1812, we could have a whole nother discussion about this, but the foreign policy that was made was that we would go to war with Great Britain. This becomes known as the Second War of Independence. The United States was able to hold off the British without really anything being gained or lost by either side, but the United States gained a lot of things like national pride as a result of the War of 1812. Then the last one we'll talk about is James Monroe. In North America, we see a lot of Latin American countries gaining their independence from particularly Spain and other European powers. The result of that is the Monroe Doctrine. With Latin America gaining their independence, we see that Spain is being pushed out, and there are very few European powers left in North America at this time. So what we see is countries like Mexico gaining their independence and other countries in Central and South America gaining their independence from these European powers. The response to this is something known as the Monroe Doctrine. And what James Monroe says with the Monroe Doctrine is that North and South America are closed to European colonization. Now, there's a lot of schools of thought out there surrounding this and what was the ulterior motive of the United States to make this declaration. But for all intents and purposes, what we need to know is that James Monroe essentially closed off North and South America to future colonization by European powers. So this really wraps up the first 5 presidents and some of the issues that they dealt with in terms of their foreign policy. There's a lot more information out there about each of these topics. I would encourage you to take a look at that. But here is just a brief overview. So thanks for listening.